You're very welcome to another episode of the Scaling Your Business podcast. For this episode 188, delighted to be joined by Patrick Woods, the co-founder and CEO of Orbit. Patrick, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on today. I'm really excited to get into the conversation and hopefully share some useful things with your audience.
Likewise, typical fashion of the show, Patrick, we go right back to the beginning. So I don't know where you grew up or what state you grew up in, but I do know that you studied journalism at the University of Memphis. So you grew up close by. Take me back to where you grew up and what life was like growing up, and then we'll jump onto journalism in uni.
Yeah, growing up, boy, that's I'm not sure I've gone back that far to the beginning in a podcast in a while, but yeah, I grew up in the Memphis, Tennessee area. Was a band kid in high school, so played percussion sort of in middle school and high school. Was always involved with music. My parents were both avid readers growing up. Always had bookshelves of books, and always talking about who's reading which things. And I don't know, my mom still does crossword puzzles and plays Scrabble to this day. But I think that sort of love for storytelling and language is what got me interested in sort of the path I went sort of at university with regard to with journalism in particular. But at the University of Memphis, and many schools, believe it or not, the advertising program sits in the journalism and communications department versus like the business school. And so for me, I kind of was interested in storytelling and marketing ideas, advertising, and didn't really know the appropriate path to take. So I started university and was actually started out in the marketing department of the business school, and took a bunch of business courses, financial and managerial accounting, microeconomics, a lot of things that were pretty far removed from kind of the storytelling and the kind of the creative angle that I was really interested in. Realized that the more appropriate path was journalism / advertising. So made my way over to that part of the university, and kind of that's all she wrote. So yeah, spent many years learning about PR, communications, advertising, writing at scale, and a lot of things that are, I think, pretty useful today with Orbit, and kind of like my role here as kind of like, I don't know, chief storyteller, if you will. But around that time, I guess sort of like the big idea at Orbit is all about the power of community, both for the individuals in the community as well as for the businesses that operate those communities. And at the university in Memphis, that's when I sort of got my first taste for the power of community. So after university, I was working at an ad agency in Memphis, and started a few different programs to bring people together. Some friends and I, we started a group that was sort of like a hybrid, networking event / young professionals thing / dating sort of thing, is all sort of mashed up into one. And basically the theory was there's a lot of interesting young people in the city, and there's not a really one single place for them to meet. And so we started producing a series of events to bring folks together for conversations. And over the course of a few years, we ended up running hundreds of events. By the time we wound that program down, we were averaging a few hundred people per month at our event. And we sort of heard really cool stories about people finding jobs at this meetup and finding dates and starting businesses and starting nonprofits. And really, it was just our theory was that if we could create the context for people to have sort of a low barrier of entry to meeting others, then that would just produce all sorts of interesting second and third order effects down the road that we couldn't predict. And so that was, for me, a blast. Learned a ton about community building from that experience, and saw that when you create the space for conversation and set the expectations appropriately, then cool things happen. And so when I think about my sort of career, and all this weird stuff I've done, that series of events was called Undercurrent. Undercurrent for me was a really important inflection point in my kind of personal and professional journey of understanding how to harness groups of people, and really think with a sort of a give first mindset. So yeah, we're sort of covering a lot of ground here from early days to sort of like more modern days. Yeah. But yeah, when I think about my trajectory, that experience of getting folks together has been very meaningful as we've built the business today. So happy to drill into any of those specific points that I might have glossed over there.
Yeah, slick. And I do want to jump into specifically the community building side of things. But before we get in that, I'd like to make our way there through some questions of lessons learned from previous roles. So I don't know if you touched on it, any of the kind of things you were suggesting and talking about for the last 2 or 3 minutes, but you spent almost 7 years as an owner of your own business, Megaphone Productions. And the reason why I picked one of these things out of your LinkedIn was I know how difficult it is to start your own business. Um, you know, on your LinkedIn, it referenced freelance graphic and web design company, Megaphone Productions. So take me back to the early days, and I picked the early days because it's often interesting looking back and easier looking back in hindsight of some of the things that you not embarrassed by, but like I would have done that differently if I knew now what I knew, if I know now what I knew then. You get what I'm trying to say? So what are some of the kind of, if you were to go back in time, what would you perhaps do differently knowing what you know now?
Yeah, so that business was basically a freelance sort of part-time thing that I ran during undergrad and grad school to, pay the bills, make ends meet. Context was yeah, a combination of web design, print layout, kind of advertising. Like I said, my degree was in advertising, so it's the confluence of a lot of my skill sets. And yeah, I was one of probably many of us who kind of like learned web design early on just because it was interesting. I learned over time that I'm not a designer like a capital D like the real designers out there, but certainly learned to appreciate the sort of the tactics and the theory of design, which was very helpful in my advertising career, as you can imagine, sort of on the account strategy side of things. I mean, lessons learned from that time. I'd have to think about it just a little bit. I think, focus. I probably could have focused a bit more in terms of like the types of clients I worked with. Given that it was part-time business, I didn't have a ton of capacity to spend on business development and things like that. So I think over time I've experienced or come to appreciate the value of focus in terms of like customer base and like who I'm focused on. This is true at Orbit as it was then, which is, are there similarities, commonalities in the types of folks we're going to market with? Certainly helps focus your marketing messages and your content and the even pricing and packaging. So, at that time I was young, didn't know what I was doing, and sort of would take any business I could get, like probably a lot of us starting out. And so, I think that probably led to some dilution in terms of like the overall portfolio because, local music business, local church, local real estate agency, you pick up a lot of odd jobs when you're doing freelance web development. And this was, 20 years ago when, nobody knew anything about web development and small business marketing. So, yeah, I think I probably would have spent a lot more time honing the positioning and the focus of the customer base, I would say.
I like that lesson, and it's a great one because you develop a name within that. Let's use the word community, and you get more business as a result of that. But if you're trying to pick up anything and everything that's coming to you, you never really build a name for one specific niche. So I do like that lesson. Before we go to your current role and all around community building, the other role I wanted to touch on was some of the corporate roles. 2016 to 2018, you were in two different roles. Keen.io and Figure Eight. Both of them, you were director of customer success. So within those roles, specifically the corporate side of things, what are perhaps some skills or behaviors that you improved in an environment like that, whether managing a team or some attitudes you may have shifted? Talk to me big picture.
Yeah, so to take one step back from Keen and from Figure Eight, I worked for several years at an ad agency, and the ad agency was sort of a classic kind of like big ad agency with big accounts and doing TV ads and big campaigns and national things and things like that. I actually at the agency started a new business unit to work with startups specifically. So I realized that at the agency, we had big clients like, I don't know, Pfizer and FedEx and some huge accounts. Those logos look really great on a client list, but the actual day-to-day work is not always the most creative and interesting just because they're, big accounts. And yet we had a building full of the most creative, artistic people you've ever met, and they're spending their day working on what some might consider boring work. At the same time, startups, the sort of Memphis startup scene was kind of getting up and running, and I was spending a lot of time in various places in startup communities, and realized that startups are really interesting, and they're always bad at naming and branding. And this was a time frame, you might remember, there was like a 2-year period where every startup was like had ly at the end of it, like .ly was a thing, like Bitly, Startuply, everything was just like an ly, and it just like there's all these cyclical trends that happen in startup branding. And the theory was that if I could connect the creatives from the agency with startups in need, we could do some pretty cool work together, help early stage companies accelerate their brand, and then help our agency do more interesting work. So I spun that up. We did that for a couple of years, had some pretty fun successes, and that's actually how I met Keen.io. So Keen.io is one of my clients. We did some work with them on the brand side of things, and then when they raised their, I can't recall, their Series A or B, they said, look, we've got a bunch of customers, but no one's overseeing their success. Would you be interested in coming over in-house and kind of like running our customer success team? And for me, it was a compelling opportunity, because agency world's fun because you work on a lot of different things. You see a lot of different types of businesses, but it's also kind of a bummer because you do all this great work, and then the company keeps on without you. And it's certainly very, very mercenary work versus like getting in the trenches and like going for the long term with a business. So I was keen to use a silly metaphor, silly turn of phrase, to join the company. And yeah, the shift from sort of agency world to in-house, there's lots of lessons learned. I mean, I went from in an agency, you sort of lead by influence. So I was like an account director, strategy person. And so I worked with, I don't know, 15 or 20 creatives, but none of them reported to me directly. They all reported to the creative director. And so in agency world, you have to, you get things done through influence versus like, command and control, quote unquote, which was a great lesson to bring into sort of a more corporate setting, because you often find yourself in a similar situation where you need to get work from lots of people who aren't in your direct, reporting line. So I think that type of, sort of like almost like jazz improvisation when it comes to leadership proved pretty useful coming into a company like Keen. And Keen was a great company. Like everybody was super kind and empathetic, so it wasn't that difficult of a transition. But I think bringing those perspectives in was quite helpful for me early on, just in terms of building credibility and relationships with other functional leaders.
So Orbit, your current business, you'll do a much better job at, let's say, the 30-second commercial or the elevator pitch than I will, because it's your baby. So the mic is all yours.
So if you think about the way we buy things today, like as consumers, I just bought a new bag for some international travel. And in the process of purchasing that bag, what did I do? I looked for reviews. I went to Reddit, of course, the source of all consumer knowledge, read all the sort of teardowns of various bags. I watched videos. I wanted to understand the conversation in the category before I made a decision. I wanted to educate myself on the landscape before ultimately making a purchase decision. It turns out this way of purchasing is also true today in software world. So there was an old sort of the old days was a salesperson would call you, you're the CIO, you're the CTO, the sales rep would call you, take you to a steak dinner, you would make a purchase decision on behalf of your company, and then everybody in the company would use that software. It turns out the way software is being bought and sold today looks a lot more like that consumer research and adoption model as compared to the old school kind of like top-down sales approach. Okay, so what does that mean for companies? For companies, it means that increasingly their community is a much bigger part of their overall strategy in terms of go-to-market, product feedback, brand awareness. And yet for all of our customers, so Orbit has many thousands of customers, their community is spread across many places online. So it's a combination of Twitter plus a Discord server, maybe a forum, Eventbrite, other sort of event tools, learning management platforms, social media. And so ultimately our customers all are trying to engage with and grow communities across a dozen plus channels. And so this makes it really difficult for the company to understand several things. First of all, like who are the champions, who are the biggest advocates across all those channels. Those data sources are all siloed. It also means the customer journey is very segmented. So the experience that I might have as one of your customers on Discord feels different than Twitter. It feels different than the events I go to. And at the end of the day, it means the company spends a lot of time trying to collate data from various sources, because again, the reporting mechanism for those tools is like completely fragmented. So with Orbit, we make it really easy to integrate data from all those channels, such that you as the user can see a unified view, a single pane of glass, if you will, of a person's journey across all those channels. So you can see, for example, somebody, last week somebody followed you on Twitter, and then the next day came to your Discord server and asked some questions about the product, and then the next day actually created a trial account of your software, and then became really active in the product, and then on Thursday came back to Discord and asked more questions, and then they attended office hours. And so you can imagine that sort of full 360 view of the customer journey unlocks all sorts of opportunity from a messaging standpoint, an engagement standpoint, tracking ROI. And so, our customers really think of us as a community growth platform, which means they can not only measure what's going on in the community, but take action to drive more conversations, engagement, event attendance, and ultimately revenue at the end of the day.
I imagine that marketers love this, not only from identifying the champions, but from being able to showcase the value of certain areas of the business that a CEO perhaps or a VP of sales might look at and go, that's not directly impacting revenue, so let's get rid of it. But the marketers can now say, actually, as a result of this, it led to that, which led to this, and 62% of our monthly revenue this month came from that. If we get rid of this podcast, it's going to have a detrimental effect on our revenue 8 weeks from now.
That's exactly right. We have a lot of conversations with our customers around how data from Orbit brings visibility to previously invisible customer journey touch points. And yeah, you're really hitting the nail on the head here, because it's easy as executives or revenue leaders to sort of look at the sort of short-term first order impact of things. It's like, oh, the podcast, well, it's very expensive, it takes a lot of time. Why are we doing this? Why don't we just do more paid ads? Because we can see the conversion rate from those. It's easy to be what I would consider short-term greedy versus long-term greedy. And the Orbit users, the data that's in Orbit really enables for them the chance to have the conversation about these longer-term, second, third order effect points of impact that they previously weren't able to have. So it kind of gets to our overall vision, which is we think Orbit can actually help our users not only capture more value for the company, but also create more value for their customers and community members, because for the first time they have the underlying data to know that it's working. So things like podcasts and meetups and events, those things are hugely valuable to the community member. And now with the Orbit, it sort of closes the loop on the ultimate value those provide to the company themselves. So hopefully it's a win-win.
I also imagine that depending on the size of the company, it's better for the business to control the community or feel like they control the community rather than people themselves. Because if you don't have a community and you're a big size company talking plus 1,000 people, your users are going to generate a community for you or about you in a Discord channel or a Reddit channel, and for you not to be there again could be massively detrimental to the business.
Yeah, I think that's right. For our customers, they appreciate the ability to facilitate those conversations and participate in them. I mean, ultimately, if people love your brand and your product, people are going to have conversations all over the place about you. But when we think about it, the role of the community, the role of the company in those communities is really to sort of advocate bidirectionally for both sides of the equation, meaning the community managers, the community advocates for the company can bring information from the company into the community. And so talk about product things that are coming up, changes to different plans, and advocate for different use cases and make sure everybody's trained and knows how to use the tool most effectively. But it goes the other way as well. They actually are the ones who can build those deep relationships with individuals in the community and then take those learnings back to the company and say, here's what we're hearing. 10 out of 10 of our champions are saying this feature is broken, or if we could build this, we would see churn go down because this is what we're hearing from our users. And what we found is that a healthy community that the company is participating in, it really de-risks pretty much every other part of the business. It means that your marketing messaging and sort of like your copy can almost be tested in the community, such that when you scale them out to paid programs and big campaigns, you sort of know what's going to land because you've been talking to the community about it already. Or from a product standpoint, you can leverage the community to get that early feedback and talk to your champions about different roadmap opportunities and how to prioritize things coming up and close the feedback loop. When it comes to sales and like go-to-market things, a warm introduction from a community member is so much more impactful than like an SDR sort of cold emailing someone trying to get on their calendar. So this is where the community ROI really comes into focus, is that it really makes every part of the business much more efficient and easier. And so that's why our customers choose to really catalyze the community themselves versus kind of like letting it happen organically and hope it works out for the best.
One more question around the community side of things before we jump into one or two other areas. Is there a commonly held belief about the industry that you work in that you, let's say, passionately disagree with?
I think this question would have been different just a number of months ago, but I think the industry is sort of coming around to my quote unquote beef, and I'll just talk you through what that looks like. So, what we have found is that, as mentioned, there are many outcomes of a thriving community. Revenue is part of it, and that revenue could be in the form of introductions to leads. It could be accelerated pipeline through community engagement. A number of our customers now talk about using Orbit to drive six-figure deals, to find champions, to craft better outbound. There was a cultural thing in the community world, and specifically in developer relations, which is sort of like an area we have tons of customers, that was almost adverse to talking about revenue, almost spiritually, if you will, that the community should be able to stand on its own, independent of revenue outcomes and business outcomes. The community is here to provide value for people, full stop. But we've really seen it in the past year or so, that sentiment change a lot. And I think maybe, hopefully, we've been part of that conversation to some extent. But what we found is that, sales should not be a four-letter word to community builders. But the context and the approach is very important. So what I mean by that is, if I'm a community manager and I have a relationship with one of our community members, the last thing I want is an aggressive salesperson to come in and say, "Hello, I saw you in Discord. Why don't you jump on a call? Let me tell you about our enterprise plan. I think you'd love it." Completely like arbitrarily aggressive. That's not great. What a better version of that is, through my conversations with that community member, I realize that based on what I'm hearing and how they've grown with us over the past year, they actually are ready to talk to a salesperson, because if they were on that bigger plan, we could help them get to their goals faster, and we could help them prove ROI even more effectively, and all these sort of things. And so what we found is that the culture has shifted around the relationship between sales and community, but everyone has sort of matured. Like, salespeople are a lot more sophisticated now with how they go about this. Community leaders have tuned into the fact that they've got to have a revenue story to remain relevant. And so, I'm not sure I have a hot take anymore, because I think we've helped sort of like bring the industry forward and have this conversation together about what's the most appropriate experience for every member of the community. And if the appropriate experience for a community member is an introduction to the sales team, great. If the appropriate experience for the community member is they need to get a sticker because they're awesome, that's great. And so really it's about having a shared vocabulary and a shared sense of understanding about what that right experience is for every person in the community. When we zoom out all the way, we think about this distinction between value capture and value creation, and that certain parts of the business, like marketing and sales, they're thinking a lot about value capture. How do we convert these folks into revenue? That's what they should be thinking about. Community managers, developer advocates, folks like that, events people maybe, they're often thinking about creating as much value as possible for the folks in the community. So That could be content, it could be programming, it could be events, it could be introductions, meetups, things like that. And so it's really helpful if business leaders have both of those concepts in mind. And then you can ask yourself, for any given program or tactic or strategy, are we trying to create value for the community, or are we trying to capture value for the company? And if everyone's clear on those intentions, it means we can be a lot more explicit with the programming itself, but also the way we measure success. So if we say, yeah, we're gonna host a series of office hours with the explicit goal of like helping our users connect to other users so they can level up, that's a value creating activity. That's very different than saying we're going to do a webinar with 10 enterprise leads to get one of them to commit to a contract, And so are we doing value capture? Are we doing value creation? If you at least have that conversation, it helps frame up the discussions and make sure you're delivering the appropriate experience to the right people.
When you look at the next 7, 8, 9 quarters ahead, in terms of growth, where are you going to land net new logos is my question here. Is it predominantly from partnerships, word of mouth within your community? Have you got an outbound model? Talk me through kind of the top 2 to 3 ways that you and Orbit are going to land net new logos over the next couple of quarters.
Yeah, so where we are today, we've got 3,000 or 4,000, maybe 5,000 companies using us. Our customers are managing a little more than 32 million community members across all their platforms. So starting to see some pretty interesting scale there. To date, the vast majority of that adoption has been community driven, content driven, word of mouth, very organic. That's a flywheel that has worked pretty well for us. For context, we created this framework called the Orbit model, which is, we could probably do a whole podcast on it, but the Orbit model, the short version is basically, it's almost like think about how impactful the sales and marketing funnel has been as a metaphor for like measuring everything in business. If you go to any business meeting, like somebody's going to talk about the funnel. What's top of funnel look like? What's the bottom of the funnel look like? And interestingly, the funnel as a metaphor is very useful for optimizing a linear or binary problem. So product onboarding where every person goes through the same steps, or an enterprise sale where there's a binary outcome at the end you can then measure and feedback. What we realized, and actually Josh, my co-founder, and I, we spent about a year consulting in the community and DevRel space before starting the business. We realized everyone was trying to measure community, and they were trying to use the funnel to measure it. But because the funnel is great for linear and binary problems, it wasn't great for community. Community is not linear, it's not binary. And so we said, we've got to have a metaphor that's actually built from first principles to measure what actually happens in community. So we published a blog post about the Orbit model. It's pretty short, but it basically said, you should think about increasing the gravity of your community. And the components of that are a couple of things, reach and love and things like that. And love is actually a measure, we actually measure on the product, but it's a product of the recency, frequency, and quality of every community member's participation. So if you know every single person's how recently, frequently they've engaged, and like what was the quality of that engagement, you can build out a pretty cool network model of who's leaning in, who's fading away. So all that to say that blog post turned into long form content on GitHub. It turned into some Airtable templates. And for the past 3 years, the Orbit model as an idea has been very helpful in terms of raising awareness of what we're trying to do sort of as a brand and as a company. And so we have a number of customers that come to us and say, yeah, we were thinking about changing our community strategy. We came across the Orbit model, and we realized the Orbit model is not only a cool idea, but there's actually software that helps us do that and scale that. And so the Orbit model as a framework has been useful, not only in educating the sort of world on how to think about these ideas in a more organic and I think authentic way, but also in terms of driving awareness of the platform. So we will continue to invest in content, events, community, because it's obviously consistent with our worldview. We'll probably start testing outbound in the near future. We only have 2 account executives. We hired them both in the past quarter. So, we've added, 75 new logos, paying logos in the past 3 months, I want to say, on the back of that. And so we're really starting to focus on commercialization for the first time. We went live last year, like in, I think May of last year, sort of when we sort of first went to GA, general availability. So yeah, the coming year, it's a continued focus on that. Our bottom up motion is working pretty well, I think. So we have a free plan, we have self-serve paid plans, and then we have sort of the enterprise tier. And so for us, most of our users start with the free plan, and they come and they set up Orbit, they plug in 2 or 3 data sources, start to get some value, and then they hang out there for months or a year, depending. And then as they start to grow the team, as the community starts to grow, that puts them on the path to like swiping a credit card for one of our self-serve plans. And then as they grow even larger and they want enterprise features like, SSO and audit logs and things like that, and also access to our sales, or excuse me, our success team, our solutions engineering team, things like that, they transition to the enterprise plan. So I anticipate, continuing to lean into that kind of like bottom up motion, investing in our own community, investing in content to create a lot of value, and making sure everyone knows that Orbit's here. I think that probably summarizes the majority of our go-to-market for the coming several quarters. That's of course coupled with sort of like smaller events, meetups, things like that. Those always work pretty well for us.
Is your business model a monthly subscription?
It's a combination of monthly subscription as well as annual agreements. So the larger customers, the enterprise folks, are all on annual plans. But yeah, the self-serve folks are all month to month.
I'm going to leave a link to the Orbit model below because I read it and really enjoyed it myself. You create a lot of content and value for both your current clients and clients that I'm assuming you're hoping to attract, whether to get them into the free model and they can see the value to then upgrade to the next level. One of the other things that I noticed, because I was going through your Twitter, was you launched a newsletter, but a paper edition, Gravity. Do you want to give a quick shout out to what it is? Because I'm going to leave a link to it below if anybody wants to subscribe to it. So yeah, the mic is yours. And then after that, I have one final question to wrap up.
Yeah, so we've thought about ways to create value for our audience, our community. We realize that so much content today is, it exists in the form of blog posts, tweets, things like that. And we thought it would be an interesting test to sort of experiment with the real world. And what would it look like to do a quarterly publication, a quarterly journal, if you will, of community building ideas. And so that was kind of the genesis of Gravity magazine. It was inspired by Stripe had a print publication called Increment for many years, and it was certainly inspired by that. But yeah, the pitch is that we would, put together interesting stories from contributors inside and outside of Orbit. Each edition would be custom illustrated, so sort of a new contribution to the world, if you will. And so yeah, it's the second issue's coming out within the next couple of weeks. So first issue is on analytics, second issue is going to be on community growth as a concept. So it's been a lot of fun to put that together. A lot of work, but a lot of fun too.
No doubt. Final question for you, Patrick. If you were put in charge of adding a mandatory subject to the high school curriculum, what would the subject be and why?
I think it would probably be something along the lines of, personal finance. I think what we've seen lately with, the sort of asset bubble coming into the end of last year, the correction into this year, lots of folks experiencing a lot of pain with regard to like crypto drawdowns. There's been a lot of conversation around like what's happened here from a macroeconomic standpoint, and I realize that at least the U.S. there's not a lot of education around the basics of personal finance as it relates to investing and diversification, and the difference between a index fund versus direct investing. And I think society would benefit a lot with more shared context around how systems work and what that means for a person's personal financial situation. So I think that or this is an interesting question. I have lots of things. I think critical, like a course on critical thinking would probably be part of the curriculum for me. I'm a liberal arts person for sure. My wife is she has a PhD in developmental biology, so she's like very logical, very black and white. She can reason her way through very complex problems, and I think as a society we don't spend a lot of time on the tools for thinking and being able to apply the appropriate mental models and be aware of logical fallacies. And yeah, if you watch the news, it just seems like that's increasingly true. so maybe I think if everyone had sort of a shared context, or at least a shared foundation on ways to think critically, maybe we would be better off. So that would be my contribution.
Great contribution. Patrick Woods, the co-founder and CEO of Orbit. It's been a pleasure having you on the show. I'll leave links to everything we mentioned below. For today, I wish you continued success.